popular genres change slowly. In the 1960s, key British editors calling for a new wave of science fiction published powerful literary experiments like J.G. Ballard's The Crystal World and the Atrocity exhibition. Americans like Philip K. Dick and Harlan Ellison, and Europeans like Stanislaw Lem experimented too. When William Gibson's Neuromancer conjoined head-snapping rhetoric with Kafkaesque cynicism about the information age, the new wave morphed into cyberpunk. But cyberpunk is a science-fictional variety of postmodernism. Now we can see a line from Nobelist William Golding, the Lord of the Flies and The Inheritors, to Nobelist José Saramago with books like Blindness. Science fiction, the most important of the fantastic genres, is an historical response to the rise and conquest of technology. The New Wave was the first self-conscious aesthetic movement in science fiction. Highbrow literature had, from the beginning of the 20th century, begun to experiment quite consciously. We have James Joyce's Stream of Consciousness. We have different viewpoints experimented with in Virginia Woolf and so on. But popular genres, because they are intended to appeal to the widest possible reading public, meaning not the most highly educated reading public, change slowly. But in the mid-1960s, the editors of New World said, no, science fiction should come right along and take up that formal experimentation that had characterized pioneering high culture for, at that point, more than half a century. Some excellent Britons followed that call. Brian Aldiss, for example, wrote a book called Barefoot in the Head, most of which concerns the wandering of a single individual across a post-war Europe that has been blasted by a war not so much of explosive bombs, but of drug bombs that have completely disoriented the populations, and in different ways, depending upon where they were, when they were, and the kinds of drugs that they suffered from. In a sense, what Aldiss is doing in Barefoot in the Head is showing us that the competition of the modern industrial world creates for us realities that we ourselves cannot trust. And when they become confusing enough, we wander almost aimlessly through them, trying to find some place of solidity. J.G. Ballard wrote all sorts of novels that took up this cry for experimentation. For example, he wrote a series of end-of-the-world novels, one of which, The Crystal World, I particularly like. In The Crystal World, a virus or some other strange new spontaneous creation of nature begins in the jungle. And it begins beautifully. It crystallizes the leaves and then the whole trees that it encounters, and then animals. And then it spreads. And this beautiful, frozen, regularized world, we know when we come to the end of the book, is about to take us all over and leave us with nothing but inevitable regularity. There is there an echo of Zamyatin's tragic Reason Must Prevail. Somehow the horror that we have found within the jungle, or brought into it ourselves, is coming out. Ballard also wrote politically chilling tales like the Atrocity exhibition that jams images of modern news against political desire and incest and physical mutilation. In psychosexual fables like Crash, he deals with people who come to understand in our insulated world, a world in which we travel on concrete, in steel, and live in buildings of concrete and in controlled climates, that there is a kind of enthusiasm that some people can feel only when they're involved in the danger of automobile collisions. And his main characters find that their sexuality is only retrievable as they continue to put themselves in danger of automotive death. These are indeed true experimentations. This is modernist literature brought up to date in a science fictional form. At the same time that these Britons were experimenting, Americans were too. Samuel R. Delany makes language itself a weapon in his Nebula-winning novel, Babel 17. The title Babel, of course, refers to the famous Tower of Babel. People can no longer understand each other because God has smitten them with diverse languages as a punishment for their pride in trying to reach heaven mechanically. Babel 17 is a story in which the protagonist is a poet spaceship captain named Rydra Wong. The bad aliens have been at war with we Earth folk, and the weapon of war that is most troubling is the development of language. They keep developing new languages, and those languages make possible conceptions that we don't have, and so they can outthink us, outmaneuver us. Rydra Wong goes off to attack the aliens, to learn about the aliens, and with her as her first mate is a thoroughly efficient but brutal sailor, that is, space sailor, known affectionately as the Butcher. The Butcher is clearly a ruthless sailor, but he has also a history of having been captured and brainwashed by the aliens. They scrubbed his mind and implanted in the place where his language had been a language that does not possess the first-person singular pronoun. He can't say, I love you, any more than he can say, I hate you. And when he wants to say something like, I think we should do this, he winds up going, do this, punching his fist into his own hand. There comes a moment when Rydra and the Butcher have become sufficiently close because of their combined collaboration in fighting the aliens that they also become romantically involved. And in the throes of that intimate connection, Rydra the poet is able to make the Butcher suddenly re-understand the notion of I. Language itself is a weapon in Babel 17. This is a way of looking at language that is clearly not only modern, but postmodern. In the Einstein intersection, Delany has wiped out the boundaries between ancient myth and modern world. We live in some kind of post-Holocaust world where the landscape is sere and people are different sorts of mutation wander around, and they seem to inhabit the bodies of ancient gods. And yet it seems to speak of our world. Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle also seems to speak of our world, although it is explicitly what's called in science fiction an alternate history. Now, this book, published in 1962, it did in fact win the Hugo Award as best novel. This book, published in 1962, is written about a world in 1962. But this 1962 within the novel is a 1962 in which the Axis won World War II. So most of the United States is in fact dominated ruthlessly by Germany. The Western United States is part of the Japanese co-prosperity sphere and dominated by them economically, sort of the way Finland was by the USSR. And there's a thin strip, the Rocky Mountain states, in which people maintain some sense of independence, but only by recognizing the power of their neighbors to the east and west. In the Rocky Mountain states, there live some quiet rebels, one of whom has written a novel called The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. The Grasshopper Lies Heavy is circulated in handwritten copies. The Grasshopper Lies Heavy is a strange alternate history written about a world in which the Allies won World War II. Now, when you look in a mirror, you see yourself, you think, I'm kind of reversed. But if you put another mirror behind you, the image in that second mirror looks just as you think you should look, or as you would look in a photograph. So reversing a reversal should bring us back to the original configuration. In The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, because the Allies won the war, Truman integrates the armed forces, and America comes to realize the enormous impact, the tremendous contribution of non-whites to the survival of Western democracy, and by 1962, America is no longer a country with any vestige of racism. In other words, the reversal of the reversal still doesn't give us the truth, because anyone reading that book in 1962, this is before the Civil Rights Act, for example, knows that America still has many vestiges of racism. At that time, in fact, unfortunately, still including occasional lynchings. So, we take reality, we reverse it again, and somehow get a new view of our reality. This is imaginative, this is fantastic, this is science fictional, this is postmodern, this is new wave. Harlan Ellison, a remarkable writer of fast-paced and shocking short stories, produced one called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. In this story, the Earth is covered by ever more computers. And eventually, the computers link up in a network and form a totalizing intelligence, which runs machines to complete the encapsulation of the Earth in one big machine skin, which is all one big computer that is known as AM. It is alone. Like Frankenstein's monster, it has no peers. And it is so angry that humanity has allowed it to be created that it keeps 5 human beings alive forever in its bowels so that it can torment them. Human life becomes hell inside the body of the machines that we created. This is a modern updating of Frankenstein. If Frankenstein's monster shows us what happens when science, the doppelganger for the creator, Frankenstein, goes out on its own, unrestrained by the community that would have kept Frankenstein from letting the creature go, in the modern age, we see it is the community itself that heedlessly wants to follow technology so recklessly that the technology winds up creating a hell on earth for us. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, in that sense, is a postmodern retelling of Frankenstein. We can see how science fiction moves along. It, in fact, responds to its own eras. Cyberpunk is an outgrowth of New Wave that was conditioned by certain historical and cultural shifts. The term cyberpunk refers to a constellation of features. The word itself comes from cybernetics, a term coined by Norbert Wiener for the science of communication, command, and control, with the kyber being the word for helmsman in Greek. The punk comes from the term punk music, with its associations of low-class, iconoclastic sort of social rebels. Cyberpunk. The New Wave projected a dismal worldview, characterized by stylistic experimentation and concern for ontological and epistemological problems. They did it through drug realities. Now, ontology is the branch of metaphysics that concerns the nature of being. I and you are ontologically equivalent. We are human beings. We are ontologically different from my lectern and your chair. The question is, are we ontologically different from Frankenstein's monster? Are we ontologically different from that thinking machine that keeps Ellison's last 5 human beings in perpetual thrall? In fact, those problems plague us today because we don't know the limits of our technology. How many people have said, yes, the computer knows exactly what I'm doing? We feel that we are in a world with other intelligences. That questions our limits. Epistemology is the branch of metaphysics that concerns knowing. What ways do we have of knowing? I know, some would say, God exists. But they would acknowledge that they know that in a different way from knowing that their thumb exists. And yet differently from the way they might say, I know that Tokyo is the capital of Japan, even if they've never been to Japan or Tokyo. How we know things is a deep philosophical problem. Cyberpunk concerns itself with these deep ontological problems. Drug realities are used often in cyberpunk because drugs decenter us and call into question what reality might be. Cyberpunk in particular does this using a fast-paced, jarring style and takes a radically anti-authoritarian view. In addition, cyberpunk, growing out of these changing realities, the ever larger, more totalizing activity of a corporate scientific establishment, gives us a movement of a, how shall I say this, a geographic center to science fiction. When science fiction begins with Verne writing in Paris and moves on to Wells writing in London, and then to the post-World War II hegemonic American science fiction written largely in New York, and then to the Hollywood-inflected writers of California, we finally get, in the year 1984, the publication of William Gibson's Neuromancer, where the center of science fiction turns out to be Tokyo. And if you take a look at these shifts, they follow centers of economic power. Since science cannot really change us unless it's applied, we need to have the wherewithal to make technology function. And in a sense, science fiction followed a trajectory reflecting those possibilities of change. Follow the money. As it happens, now in the 21st century, that shift seems to be coming back, and science fiction is simultaneously worldwide, and modally American again. Blade Runner, 1982, is actually cyberpunk before the cyberpunk word exists, before the publication of Neuromancer that motivated its coinage. Blade Runner is an extraordinary movie, the most important aspect of which, from our viewpoint, is that its central problem is the inability to decide who or what is human. And if one were to decide, do you have the right to kill a thing just because it's not human, even though it clearly loves and fears? The key document in cyberpunk is Neuromancer. It has a style which truly set people back when they first encountered it. Its very first sentence is quite famous. The sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel. Look at all that's captured in that sentence. The sky above the port. A port should be something that's receiving, but here we need to look above, and yet the above is invisible. This isn't a blue sky of some romantic pastoral poem. This is a sky of gray. We can't see through this featureless sky. The port could receive who knows what, but it would not be distinguishable, one part of it from the other. The color is not gray, the color of the sun in a cloudy winter day, what Thomas Hardy called neutral tones in a famous poem. It is the color of television. So we've taken the sky, which is natural, and tried to characterize it by something technological. But that's not television showing I Love Lucy. It's tuned to a dead channel. That is, somebody actually engaged that television and made it go to a place that shows us nothing but gray, and that grayness is explained by the word dead. What we have here is a tremendous clash back and forth between the realms of the mechanical and the animate. And the result of this clash back and forth is something that says to us, at the moment of reception, at the moment when we could take things in fact, we can see only death in both aspects of our world. And that's what happens in Neuromancer. The main character is a fellow named Case, and indeed, he is our case study. He is an outcast computer jockey, someone who tried to steal from his employer, and he is now taken over by someone. It turns out that this someone is working for a renegade artificial intelligence and made to go into the world, the virtual world of network connectivity. This book invents the word matrix for that. It also invents the word cyberspace, words like Frankenstein that have entered our vocabulary through literature. And in cyberspace, Case tries to break through protections in order to get the right code for his AI master. Ultimately, he does. And that AI joins with another AI to form an intelligence so vast that all human beings, if it wanted to, could be ultimately in thrall. There are many fascinating characters in this novel. A clanking bartender with a mismade artificial arm. There is Molly, an assassin who has had her eyes mechanically altered so that we see only mirror shades, and her tear ducts turned inward so that instead of crying, she spits. We have a mind bender who can thwart people by planting images in their own minds. And as I say, we have the artificial intelligence who controls Case. But perhaps the most significant character from the standpoint of understanding the relations between the human and the mechanical is a character who is a construct. His entire personality has been downloaded into silicon. The man himself has been killed, but the silicon construct is kept alive. At one point, when Case talks to this fellow, who was the greatest computer jockey of all, who's helping him willy-nilly in this quest to serve the AI, he says to him, "You know, man, you repeat yourself." "It's my nature," he replies. Ultimately, no matter how much we think we may be human encapsulated in that silicon, we are limited by the silicon. The book is arguing that humans are something beyond that. At the end of the novel, Case, who has had the one woman that matters to him at all taken from him, awakens to find himself on a beach. And on that beach, he hears off to one side a laugh. And it's the laugh of that construct. The construct had said, the one thing I want from this chore is that when we are done, I be destroyed. Did you destroy him? Ah, no, I gave him more than he wished for, the AI says. He is kept alive, again, willy-nilly. And Case wanders down the beach, knowing he will never again see the woman that he likes, that he wants. But there's another woman there who shares the same initial with that woman. When I first read this book, I thought, well, this is sort of a happy ending, and that doesn't feel right. But then I recognized that, in fact, being forced to live against your will is a kind of hell, such as Ellison had talked about. That wandering off down the beach is a tragedy. As I said when I began this lecture, the new wave, of which the postmodern, the most strongly postmodern and historically controlled version is cyberpunk, began as an attempt to bring the stylistic experimentation of modernism into popular literature. It turns out that Neuromancer shares much with modernism. The sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel. Here's the beginning of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, and so on. You can read the first 2 pages of the poem and find almost every setting reproduced in Neuromancer. And at the end, Prufrock says, I grow old, I grow old. I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think they will sing to me. And he ends by saying, we have lingered in the chambers of the sea, by sea-girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us, and we drown. That's what the construct wants, to die. But to be forced into the position where we have no choice but to die, that's something else. William Burroughs, a strange pioneer of postmodern writing, in Naked Lunch deals with the nature of heroin, which he calls colloquially junk. Junk is the ideal product, the ultimate merchandise. The junk merchant does not sell his product to the consumer. He sells the consumer to his product. He does not improve and simplify his merchandise. He degrades and simplifies the client. He pays his staff in junk. Junk yields a basic formula of evil virus, the algebra of need, Lycase's necessity to find the solution to the trap that he's in because of the AI. In fact, Burroughs talks about the silent frequency of junk that comes in and takes over our minds. The wavelength of amphetamine is how that's expressed in Neuromancer. Postmodernism treats nature as a phenomenological construct. That is, we see nature as something that we define by the way our consciousness decides to separate one part from all of the other possibilities. In that sense, postmodernism includes New Wave and Cyberpunk. Science fiction at its most pioneering is now itself simply a variety of postmodernism. Science fiction, of course, continues to function in traditional ways. Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars series, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, massive novels, are superb hard SF, where he talks about terraforming, making Mars into a habitable planet and all of the social dislocations that happen there. But science fiction has now gone beyond both the traditional and the literary. It fills our theaters. Most popular movies, most popular examples, for example, are things like Star Wars, which are traditional. But we have substantial successes in postmodern works like Total Recall or Vanilla Sky. And we have protagonists like Case who struggle to define their reality. We go even beyond those traditional media. At the end of 1998, for the very first time, video games earned more than films. The majority of video games are, in fact, science fiction. But the very most popular video games come from the SimCity franchise. And those are works in which the player spends his or her time simply constructing a reality. Are these imaginary realities? Well, maybe they are. But if you go to an online auction, you'll find that people are willing to sell the cities they've created and the avatars, the characters that they have constructed, for real money, and they really get bought. Science fiction has already sketched a vision of a totalizing future where we can't tell the difference between the real and the virtual. Ellison's vision in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream was horrifying. Stanislaw Lem, in the Futurological Congress, gives us a drug-addled reality such that we can't tell when we take one drug to counteract another whether the new drug is giving us a vision of reality or just some other drug vision. We, in fact, can't find any basic reality. Philip K. Dick does this famously in so many books, but Ubik is perhaps the greatest, in which the very world itself changes. An explosion happens, and people reach into their pockets and take out money with different faces on them, reflecting different realities. There are people labeled as science fiction writers, and there are others like William Golding, whose prehistoric tale of clash between primates in The Inheritors, or boys abandoned on an island because of the fear of atomic war in Lord of the Flies, are really science fiction. There are other Nobelists like Garcia Marquez, whose 100 Years of Solitude is magical realism, a different variety of postmodernism. And José Saramago, another Nobelist, writes books like Blindness, in which an unexplained epidemic of white blindness rather than black blindness spreads through a population and entirely deforms the social structure of the world. That's both science fiction and postmodern. It's clear that postmodernism is our period. We wonder how the world is constructed, and of all of the ways of dealing with postmodernism, Science fiction is the only one that explicitly deals with the ways in which science and technology shape our worlds. We began this series of lectures by looking at fairy tales. We took the opportunity to construct a theoretical framework in which we could understand a continuum of the fantastic, from the most realistic to the most fantastic, with fairy tales somewhere in the middle. And they reach back before prehistory to vegetation goddesses. But they also give us a universal structure that informs all of narrative. As we saw the varieties of fantastic develop all the way through to the modern period of things like Kafka's giant insect, we found both Poe and Wells offering us hinges. Poe in part because he shows us not only the horrific and the scientific, but the clash between two different rhetorics, the romantic rhetoric and the rhetoric of science. And Wells because his genuine imagination is grounded in the scientific, but gives us a way to imagine the far future. Coming into science fiction, we see that that too goes all the way back, through utopianism, for instance, to the ancients, but down today to the postmodern present. What had once seemed imaginary now seems real. We expect the online store to tell us what else we might like to buy. People get angry if we become unreachable because we've turned off our cell phones. And ubiquitous surveillance cameras capture the faces of wandering spouses, as well as terrorists. On balance, is that bad? We might appreciate the online store's suggestion, whether we take it as good or bad. The world has become fantastic. The imagination of humanity has utterly reshaped the life of humanity through technology, the instrumentality of science. The guidebooks we need now, more than ever, are the masterpieces of the imaginative mind, because now we live in a postmodern science fictional world.